The pattern has been remarkably consistent. A locality is enduring economic tough times. The mayor decides to blame the problems on the newcomers in town, the immigrants, the people of a different color, mostly Latinos. The charge, when it was at the local level, tended to be crime. They were guilty of creating crime waves. The trouble always was first-generation immigrants, first-generation Latino families have the lowest crime rates of any demographic group. But that doesn't matter. When is truth a problem when you're demagoguing and doing all the things that these ambitious politicians do? Needless to say, it works. In Hazelton, the first town that passed an anti-immigrant ordinance that affected both housing and getting jobs, the mayor, who had tried to climb up the political level and tried to run for Congress before, became, by his own terms and his staff terms, a rock star, because he was so prominent, promoting anti-immigrant laws across the nation. Remember Lou Dobbs? He was on Lou Dobbs. They were like brothers. But when deposed, gee, what basis do you have to support the claim that the presence of Latino immigrants here has impacted crime? Well, it was his impression. It was a hunch. He had no evidence to back it up, of course. And we went through the police records and found out, surprise, surprise, that the Latino immigrant community had the lowest crime rate of any of the demographic groups in Hazelton. So that was the beginning, and as we all have heard, this path has spiraled out of control. Farmers Branch in Texas, Riverside, New Jersey, other towns took up this, or should I say other politicians took up this way to get elected. And again, it worked and worked and worked. With the 2008 economic collapse, then states started taking up this cause more because they, as statewide, were having the economic hard times. And again, who are you going to blame? The newcomers, the immigrants, Latinos. And as we know, as we just heard, it's generally worked. Gail Brewer got elected, but Mr. Pierce, 2 days ago, met his demise. So it's not a guarantee, but his constituents, he was run against by saying, you focused all your energy on this and not on improving our lives, the electorate. So you can fool some of the people all the time, whatever that is. Now there's a key player in all of this that we from LatinoJustice believe needs to always be identified here. Early, Immigration Reform Law Institute. I can never quite remember the words, it's kind of painful. They are your full service, one-stop shopping for anti-immigrant legislation. On their website and on their materials, printed materials, they offer anti-immigrant legislation of any stripe you could imagine, be it housing, be it crime, be it hiring, be it schools. They will have it, and it's constantly updated in terms of how the law has progressed. The Hazelton ordinance was very, in a sense, primitive. It was this guy, the mayor, Barletta, sitting in his basement, going on the internet, trying to find out what could be done. And he found their site, and he patched together this law and proposed it. It was passed after a very heated meeting, a town hall meeting with all the whites on one side and Latinos on the other side. But anyway, it wasn't a very good crafting job that he had done, because he hadn't consulted really with the lawyers, he just got it off the forms. They had to amend it 4 times, during the litigation, including the last day of the trial. They had to amend it one more time just to make sure it would pass muster. Fortunately, the judge in a 100-something or other page decision said no go to it and overturned it, which was upheld by the Third Circuit. The laws have been, and early has been, very clever and smart about tailoring the laws as court decisions come in such that they will pass muster, or hopefully pass muster. Unfortunately, the situation, needless to say, hasn't been so good. And this year in particular was a good year for them and a bad year for us. A good year for them because of the Chamber of Commerce decision, v. Whiting, which was talked about before, which allowed states and localities to regulate and impose restrictions on hiring, and a bad year for us because of Alabama. Alabama deserves, I don't know how to put it, but it deserves a category unto itself. It's really just a disaster that is hard to imagine until you start taking the calls from people in Alabama. We have a hotline there, and we take turns handling the intake calls, and literally they're enough to make you cry. Because people are just terrified, they're in horrible situations, you just can't imagine how bad it's gotten. Let me first go through what the law requires, or just some of the things. As someone mentioned, it had about, I don't know, 12, 15 different provisions. Many of them were knocked down, but the ones that have survived have proven to be devastating. And again, the main ones did survive, were knocked out, and yet even what has survived has been horrific. First of all, the reasonable, unlike the other courts, the district court down there upheld the reasonable suspicion standard for local police interviewing people who they have a reasonable suspicion don't have status. In Arizona, that was the key there, and Arizona made the mistake of saying, well, gee, what is reasonable suspicion? So they printed out a 20-point presentation of how you tell whether someone might be not have status, and had such things as overcrowded cars, nervousness on the person you've stopped, hanging out where other undocumented people are known to hang out, dress. I mean, it was just like red flags all over the place that just demonstrated how crazy this was. Reasonable suspicion someone doesn't have status. Other than race, what are you going to do? So that was upheld for the first time by the court down there. The provision that Juan mentioned about having business transactions with the state being as a felony to approach the state to make a business transaction. And what does that mean? And obviously we don't know. And we're getting these calls via car registrations, trailer, mobile home registrations, water utilities. We have there's families out there who've been a week or two without water, electricity, because they're government entities providing the utility service. If you have a traffic ticket, you go in and pay the traffic ticket, but then you may never come back. What do you do? If you have family, if you have kids, what do you do? Criminal court dates, what do? Do you go in, or do you just avoid it and know that a warrant's going to be made after your arrest? I mean, there are no answers here. And you're talking to people who this is their reality right now. And it's just incredibly painful. And the current challenge we're facing is how do we capture and quantify these problems in a way, both as a matter of public advocacy and hopefully as a matter of legal claim, that this law has to go down. And working at LatinoJustice, we're very oriented on the race angle here. And can we make a as-applied challenge here? And that's a very, very, very difficult challenge to make. The United States government has faced that same question. They are disturbed, as anyone is, about what's going on down there. So what did they do? They sent a letter to the 39 or 29 school boards saying, please give us your attendance records. Because one of the first impacts was the drop in attendance, primarily, if not exclusively, by Latino children. And I think it was, I don't know what it was, 30% initially, it went down, or 40%. It's hopefully subsided, that drop in attendance, but it's very, very substantial. So they wanted to get those records as an indication of the harm, the impact that this has had. And so, pretty standard deal, isn't it? Well, unfortunately, we have another politician who's now going to make a name for himself, Luther, with a great name, Luther Strange. And his background, and I got in Alabama, got to know some of the local attorneys down there. Mr. Strange lives up to his name. But he wrote back to Tom Perez and said, well, what's your legal authority to ask for this information? And Tom writes, and not only that, but he says, and I want an answer by noon on Friday, or else I'm going to take appropriate action. Whatever that meant. Throwing down this gauntlet, this deadline. Mr. Perez wrote back, outlined a full range of different statutory constitutional claims at stake here, the authority. But it didn't lay it out in the way that Mr. Strange could understand it for some reason, because he writes back and says, I'm sorry, but I don't see any legal authority here for you to demand these records. And so I'm going to take the appropriate action. And the appropriate action was he wrote the 29 or 30, whatever it is, school boards, and said he has no authority to ask for this. In essence saying, you don't have to respond and probably won't respond. So he has, okay. So he has thrown down that gauntlet. Ooh, I do have an update. When deposed, gee, what basis do you have to support the claim that the presence of Latino immigrants here has impacted crime? Well, it was his impression. It was a hunch. You know, he had no evidence to back it up, of course. And we went through the police records and found out, surprise, surprise, that the Latino immigrant community had the lowest crime rate of any of the demographic groups. The pattern has been remarkably consistent. A locality is enduring economic tough times. The mayor decides to blame the problems on the newcomers in town, the immigrants, the people of a different color, mostly Latinos. The charge, when it was at the local level, tended to be crime. They were guilty of creating crime waves. The trouble always was in jobs. The mayor, who had tried to climb up the political level and tried to run for Congress before, became, by his own terms and his staff terms, a rock star, because he was so prominent, promoting anti-immigrant laws across the nation. Remember Lou Dobbs? He was on Lou Dobbs. They were like brothers. First-generation immigrants, first-generation Latino families have the lowest crime rates of any demographic group. But that doesn't matter. When is truth a problem? When you're demagoguing and doing all the things that these ambitious politicians do. Needless to say, it works. In Hazelton, the first town that passed an anti-immigrant ordinance that affected both housing and in Hazelton. So that was the beginning, and as we all have heard, this path has spiraled out of control. Farmers Branch in Texas, Riverside, New Jersey, other towns took up this, or should I say other politicians took up this way to get elected. And again, it worked and worked and worked. With the 2008 economic